Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, 21st of September. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor and your host this week. Coming up on the show, has the real migrant crisis only just begun? This week saw 12,000 migrants arrive on the island of Lampedusa. Journalist Christopher Caldwell takes a look at how far this crisis could unravel in our cover article this week. He and Douglas Murray join me on the show. Is Rishi Sunak U-turning on net zero? This week, the Prime Minister has announced several delays to previous deadlines, saying that he wants to help voters struggling with their cost of living. But is this good policy? I'll be speaking to our political editor, Katy and our political correspondent, James Heale. Australia is voting on The Voice in a few weeks' time. No, it's not a new reality TV show, but a deeply controversial constitutional question, going to the heart of how Australia was born. Is it what the people want? I'll be speaking to Australian lawyer and writer Helen Dale. And finally, 125,000 Hong Kong Chinese have arrived in Britain in the last 2 years, yet this massive wave of migration is barely commented on. Why not? I look at the issue in an article for the magazine this week, and on the show I'll be joined by Reverend Dave Ho Young, whose church is settling in new arrivals in Leeds, and Simon Cheng, a former political activist in Hong Kong who sought asylum in the UK in 2020, and has since worked to set up the organisation Hong Kongers in Britain. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thousands are joining our channel every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, in the last week, 12,000 migrants arrived on the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa, more than doubling its population in one day. As European leaders panic, is this only just the beginning? For the cover piece this week, Christopher Caldwell takes a look at what is to come. He joins me now along with our columnist Douglas Murray, who writes in his column this week about how little has changed since 2015, the last time he was in Lampedusa. Douglas and Chris, welcome to Spectator TV. Douglas, take us back to 2015 when you went to Lampedusa. That was at the beginning of what we now call the migrant crisis. What did you see?
That's right. I went there for the Spectator, as it happens, 8 years ago now. And at that point, the island, which had about 6,000 inhabitants, was getting a lot of boats coming. I think just at the time I was there were 1,200 people in the asylum center there. They were trying to get the people straight off as fast as possible off the island up to Sicily into mainland Italy. And this was something I then ended up seeing in other places, as Christopher has in the Isle of Lesbos, in other islands across Greece. And that summer, of course, more than 1 million people came illegally into Europe. And Europe buckled, but was told effectively by its political leaders that this was a sort of one-off. And I knew that was absolute nonsense. What had been happening on Lampedusa had been happening at a lesser extent for some years. And it was clear that a kind of cordon had broken. And I think what we've seen this past week, is a demonstration of that.
Well, Chris, tell us about what has happened in the last couple of weeks, because you've written about it in our cover article this week.
Well, basically, you've had a steady volume of traffic to Lampedusa, as Douglas says. But over the course of about 5 days last week, Lampedusa got 11 or 12,000 people, which totally overwhelmed that detention center in the middle of the island that Douglas was talking about, and have actually overwhelmed public transport and the public transport on other islands as well, and turned it into a bit of a political crisis for Giorgia Meloni's government. Meloni is a politician who sort of alarmed a lot of European journalists when she came to power a year ago, because she's descended from the kind of Mussolini-friendly part of the Italian right. But in fact, over the course of the past year, she's ruled in a very, very moderate, and I would even say a center-left and pro-European way. And so she's reached a point now where the main threat to her domestically is from her actual base, from people who don't believe she's been, let's say, conservative or nationalistic enough. And that in turn is sort of that is being noticed in other European countries, which are beginning to have their own immigration discussions.
And Chris, I want to talk a little bit more about the political ramifications in just a second, but why is it that there's been such a huge wave in the last couple of weeks? Is it because of the natural disasters, the floods, the earthquakes that's been happening in North Africa? Is there something of a breaking point? What's happened?
I don't think it's the flood in Libya, although I do think Libya is the key. Douglas spoke of a cordon being breached, in 2015 in terms of behavior. I think in the case of Lampedusa, the important breach of the cordon came in 2011 with the Euro-American invasion of Libya. Now, people were very impatient with Muammar Gaddafi. There were reasons to be impatient with him, but he had kept the immigration pressures from Africa pretty well bottled up. There's very little regulation of these flows now. It's very catch as catch can. The Italians they've been in negotiations with the Libyan Coast Guard. It's just very irregular. And so why were there 11,000 people this week? I don't exactly know, but it may just have to do with the scheduling of the people who are trafficking these people, or with something going on deeper in Africa. But I think that it's the anarchy in Libya. If you had to name one factor, the proximate cause would be the anarchy in Libya, and the larger cause is the absolutely unbelievable demographic growth in Africa.
And Douglas, I thought your column in this week also on this topic was very interesting, because you talk about why politicians haven't managed to fix this in the 8 years since you went to Lampedusa. I mean, we've had, migration has been top of the agenda for a lot of people and for political discourse in Europe. You've written a book about it. You've got people like Meloni who come into government on this platform. So why can politicians like her not fix it?
Well, as Chris has said, and Chris has written a book about this as well, I mean, it's been a long simmering issue in Europe, and I'd argue the wider West. It's the same issue America is facing at its southern border. Modern democratic nation states seem to find it hard to defend their borders, certainly in Europe and North America. The interesting thing is, as you mentioned, that there is serious public worry about this, as there is in Britain with the small boats coming across the channel that keep breaking records. In Britain, our politicians say this is our number one priority and we're going to deal with it, and then they don't. Giorgia Meloni's number one priority, says she wants to deal with it, then she doesn't. And the sort of online know-alls and sort of some of the conspiracy types at this point say, aha, she's been completely bought. She's become a shill of the EU and so on. I don't actually have much time for Meloni. She doesn't have very much time for me either. She's not my type of politician. But I was very struck when she came in. I thought, okay, well, there's one thing she's really going to be tested on. And so far, she's failed. There she was in Lampedusa this week, alongside Ursula von der Leyen. And once again, Meloni is an Italian prime minister saying, we are taking too much strain in Italy. The EU is not doing enough. And I think, wow, how many years have I heard that for? It's still true, but it still has to be said. And the real explanation, I think, or one of the explanations that I give in my column, and I think hasn't been pointed out enough, is look at what has happened to some of her rivals. Look at what happened to Matteo Salvini, who was Interior Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. He's technically a sort of ally of Meloni's, but also, of course, a rival. Salvini actually did manage to slow down the boats landing in Lampedusa and Sicily. How did he do it? Among other things, by simply forbidding them permission to land. And that included NGO ships. And this is very important, because it's not just the smuggling networks in the Mediterranean. The smuggling networks work with some NGOs to test the nation-state's borders. And there were NGO ships off the coasts of Italy, and Matteo Salvini refused to allow them to land. Now, what has happened since? It's true that the flow of migrants reduced, but Salvini has been twice prosecuted, including by an overwhelming vote in the Italian Senate to prosecute him for what? Kidnapping was the title. Kidnapping the people on the boats by refusing to allow illegal migrants to land. So I give that example. Very quickly, I'll give another example. Inge Støjberg, who Denmark was very lucky to have as their integration minister in 2015 till 2019. Inge Støjberg was the most important figure to make sure that Denmark did not make the mistake Sweden did in 2015 and take in hundreds of thousands of people they then couldn't integrate. So Denmark didn't do that, largely because of Inge Støjberg. What has Inge Støjberg's reward been for keeping her country's borders secure? She has been prosecuted in Denmark. She was sentenced to prison for effectively defending the borders of Denmark. She had to wear an ankle bracelet. So when Maloney or any other European politician of right or left is looking at this, if you do the wrong thing and you make sure that you just allow a constant flow of illegals into your country, you will retire fine. You will be on NGO boards, you'll be on bank boards, you'll be just fine. If you do the right thing and enforce your country's borders, you are likely, very likely, to face the rest of your life in the courts.
Well, Douglas, on that lawfare is clearly incredibly concerning, especially for democratically elected politicians. But, to Chris's point about the underlying causes, things like the 2011 military intervention in Libya, how much can these politicians really have fixed it? These suggestions, for example, like the Rwanda plan, all of these different policies which sound, on paper dramatic, but how much can that really fix what's, something of a structural problem here? Don't you think that actually by blaming it on lawfare, actually we're giving these politicians a bit too much credit? Maybe they couldn't have fixed it anyway.
Well, I think they could. I don't see why it's impossible to enforce the law. I mean, we enforce the law on lots of other things. It's extremely difficult to get to a country like America or Britain legally. Why is it so wildly easy to get into it illegally? I'm sorry, it is easy. Everyone talks about the perilous journey. You only have to spend a few hours in a boat. It only costs a few $1,000s. It's very easy. You walk straight in and you've got a hotel. And then you'll get a work permit as well. The legal route is extremely difficult. The illegal one has become easy. I'm sorry, politicians can sort that out. I don't think it's the world's hardest Rubik's Cube.
Chris, what do you think? And also on that point about legal versus illegal routes, people often say if you gave them more legal routes, if you could properly separate those fleeing political persecution, fleeing war and famine from those who are just looking for, economic migration, then actually the public will be more on side. What about that argument?
That's very, very hard to do. And I there was a good article in Il Foglio, which is an Italian newspaper this week by a writer named Giancarlo Loquenzi. And he talked about this shibboleth that all immigration politicians, all politicians who talk about immigration, they say that the real solution to this problem is to develop Africa, to give migrants more opportunities in the places where they are. I think that if that were easy to do, I think the private sector would be looking into ways of doing it. The fact is, Europe is where you connect to the global economy. There's not. It's going to be. It would take a very, very long time, longer than the next generation, to create such an infrastructure abroad. Even if it were possible, you're talking about building up an economy in an entire other continent, which Europe has very few resources now to spend on its own. I just don't see how that is possibly going to happen. So it becomes a question of, actually, one hates to talk this way, it becomes a question of defending the border, of just sort of physically keeping people from crossing that border. And that's it. That is a military problem. It's not a courtroom problem or something. You just have to create physical obstacles to passing. And in that, we have a kind of an underlying philosophical problem. We have a kind of our governing classes, and generally this is, in most countries, this is as true of the putatively conservative party as it is of the putatively progressive party. There's an allergy to thinking of politics this way, as this sort of like the use of force to keep people from doing one thing or another. And there's another dimension to it, which is that the rhetoric surrounding human rights is very hard to confine to the rhetoric of citizenship. So human rights rhetoric tends to work against Republican rhetoric. It tends to, it's very hard to sort of like establish that citizens have these rights, and then to answer the question of, well, okay, if the people on your street have the right to walk freely, why don't the people in this other country? It's a complex argument, but until we're clear, but as long as we're not clear on it, it's very easy to game the system.
Can I add one thing to that, Cindy, which is absolutely agree with what Chris just said, but the argument that you need to improve the economies of Africa before you can solve this problem. First of all, I mean, it's like, just, will it ever happen in anyone's lifetime? Who knows? Are you willing to sacrifice the future of Europe to that? Personally, not. But secondly, it's a fallacy. Theresa May used to say this during the migration crisis. She used to say, we need to work at improving the economies in the countries people are coming from. Flat out wrong. You can improve the economies, nice thing to do, good thing for those people. That doesn't solve the migration problem. In fact, a lot of the evidence shows if the lifestyle of the people in a particular country rises in Africa slightly, you get more migrants coming to Europe because they have the means to come to Europe. So this is all built on a set of massive fallacies. And to paraphrase something David Goodhart said some years ago, that we in Europe in particular, but America as well, have made two massive miscalculations that are generational. The first is we have massively underestimated the number of people who want to come. And in sub-Saharan Africa alone, that is just a bottomless number of people. So we have massively underestimated the number of people who want to come to our countries, and we have massively overestimated our ability to integrate them. It's a joke that the people, this is what I realized when I first was on Lampedusa. It's a joke to think that these people are going to soon become Milanese Italians or Florentine Italians, and they're going to meld into the culture of Dante and Boccaccio and much more. It's a joke. They won't. Their lives will be very miserable in Italy. They will be in a criminal underclass gang world where at best they will be selling illegal handbags on bridges in Venice and running from the police when they come. The idea that this is the next generation of Europeans is for the birds.
I don't think that intervention to make Africa more wealthy is something that the West should be engaging with. And as Chris has suggested, in some ways, intervention was the very first problem in the first place. But Douglas, where do you draw that line when it comes to integration? Because do you think it's a volumes problem? Do you think that some cultures inherently find it difficult to integrate? Because in the magazine this week, I also have a piece out talking about the 125,000 Hong Kongers who have come to the UK in the last 2 years. Now, what I find from meeting them is that they tend to be, 70% of them have university degrees. Many of them already speak English. They come having sold their Hong Kong flats immediately on the housing ladder here. Do you think that integration is a problem for them too? Or what is the difference here that we're talking about?
There's about three things that really matter in immigration. There is the speed, there is the numbers, and there's the identity. And that's pretty much it. If you do a difficult identity to integrate, but you do it incredibly slowly, you can just about cope. Do an identity that's hard to integrate fast and in large numbers, it's not going to work. The interesting case you give of the Hong Kongers is, of course, many of these people, apart from, as you say, they've got university degrees. I'm afraid that the random flow of people across the southern border of America or across the soft underbelly of Europe, you're not dealing with people who are massively overeducated. I'm sorry to say, but it's fact. The idea that they speak the languages of Europe, again, no, and it's difficult and it's much more difficult than it is for somebody from Hong Kong. Thirdly, people from Hong Kong, as you know, Cindy, many of them have grown up effectively under a British system of law, among other things. That it's not so it's not the hardest bit to fit into the jigsaw. In the same way, there are many people in America who are in favor of a sort of lax immigration policy in America as compared to Europe, because they say, well, look, it's Hispanics, it's They're Christians almost entirely. They can fit into our culture. Actually, Central and Southern Americans don't immediately integrate into American culture that easily, but it's a better fit than a Muslim Nigerian trying to fit into France in the 21st century. And again, I mean, these are just such obvious things, but we've made such baby steps in recent years of even acknowledging them that we can't recognize, again, speed, numbers, identity. And the ones people want to speak about least is identity.
And Chris, just finally then, we all know what's happened to European politics in the last 8 years when this crisis has not got better, it's only got worse. You write in your piece about the very many different political shake-ups, from Trump to Brexit to various kind of right-wing politicians across the continent. You also write concerningly that the migrant crisis may only just be starting, that actually this current wave is going to shake European politics to its core. What do you think is going to happen from here?
Well, it just has to do with the size. I think that of the things that Douglas was just talking about, the key thing is the size. If suddenly 1% of Florence were made up of migrants, it probably wouldn't matter where in the world they were from. Over time, they could be assimilated. But the numbers involved, particularly when you go from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, are extraordinary. So this collapse of birth rates, which we've seen in Europe probably over the last 50 years, it tends to reflect itself in aging. It tends to be camouflaged for a very long time. It takes about a couple of generations before that you start to see it in the rate of population replacement. But we're at that point now. And each successive European generation is about a third smaller than the last, or at least in a country like Italy. And then in Africa, you have a situation where the continent is just exploding with population, particularly south of the Sahara. You have there were about 200 million people in sub-Saharan Africa at the end of the colonial era, say in 1960, and by mid-century there's going to be over 2 billion. That is, from now until mid-century, there's going to be a doubling of population, and that means you have a lot of people trying to fit into an economy that doesn't have room for them, and they're young, they're dynamic, they're on the move, and so we're only at the beginning of that population growth. So yes, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
But Chris, if our population is shrinking, then we do have space for them in the economy.
Well, it's not a question of just what you have space for. I mean, it's a question of the kind of society you want to have. When you talk about the numbers, these are large enough numbers to become the culture of Europe. I mean, I assume that one wants to perpetuate the culture of Europe rather than just sort of like trade it off for another one.
Don't assume that, Chris. Don't assume that.
Yeah. No. All right. Well,
I think that is such a rich topic for pickings for another conversation, but I'm afraid we've run out of time there. Douglas Murray, Chris Caldwell, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Next, Rishi Sunak has been forced to reiterate his commitment to net zero after a series of government policies pushing back green targets were leaked earlier this week. It's caused consternation among many in industry, campaign groups, and even within his own party. But is it nevertheless good policy? I'll be speaking to our political editor, Katy and our political correspondent, James Heale. James and Katy, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, James, this story about net zero first came from a leak on Tuesday night, but Rishi Sunak has since confirmed his intentions anyway. So what do we know about the plans?
Yes, as you say, Cindy, I think the way in which the story first emerged was not how Number 10 had planned it on it, but there was this big press conference yesterday in which Rishi Sunak announced that he was going to be changing some of the measures the government planned to introduce in order to hit net zero commitments, one of which was delaying the ban on internal combustion engines, which are petrol and diesel cars, until 2035. Other was changing the way in which boilers at home was going to be rolled out until 2035 as well, and announcing more cash as well. And really, I think that, this was Rishi Sunak in the press conference yesterday in one of those forums where he really excels, which is taking questions. He's always very good at the detail, talking to people around him. They're always impressed by how he's very good at marshalling those granular details. And so I think that there was a lot of excitement beforehand because this was all the Tory civil war and the splits, etc., and net zero divides. I think after that press conference, it's kind of been quietened down a little bit. But really, this is, as Katy writes in this week's magazine, I think about trying to find some issues which are going to be difference between Labour and the Tories in the next election. And Labour have already come out and criticised Rishi Sunak plans.
Katy, is this going to divide Tories from Labour in terms of that dividing line that you write about, as much as it divides Tories themselves? Because as expected, people like Zach Goldsmith are not happy about it. And Boris Johnson has also now come out of the woodwork. So is this more of a problem for Tory civil war perspective?
I think there's enough division to go around, really. Ultimately, it does divide the Tories to a degree, to James's point. I think there was a lot of panic ahead of the speech because Rishi Sunak was effectively bounced into moving the speech forward because of that leak. And therefore, they didn't get to do the framing that they would have liked to do around it. That left a bit of a news vacuum as Number 10 worked out what to do. You had a statement confirming the report was broadly correct, but not much more. And therefore, people like Boris Johnson, Zach Goldsmith, Chris Skidmore all piled in and started voicing their concerns. The WhatsApp groups blew up. Someone, told me, it was a bloodbath ahead of the speech, effectively, on the various groups. However, when we're trying to judge Tory opinion, I think that it is not the case that Zach Goldsmith is a bellwether for mainstream Tory opinion. He is viewed by his own colleagues as pretty much on the extreme end of Tory opinion, at least when it comes to net zero commitments. He also, of course, did flirt a few weeks ago with the idea of voting Labour, and he quit as a minister in the department he was in on the environment. So all these things suggest that he's been unhappy for some time. We could have expected, I think, and Number 10 did expect him to not like it. And therefore, I think the bigger question is, are the splits significant in a way that, for example, there will be, you don't need legislation, but there will be a vote on one of the measures, but it's actually quite complicated in the sense there has to be a vote because they haven't even voted on the 2030 target. So it's not necessarily going to be this knife-edge dramatic vote that some people are thinking. But is there enough Tory unrest for people to try and cause trouble for Rishi Sunak on this issue? And I think on that, the jury is out. I think really the question is this policy a sign that Rishi Sunak is working out his electoral campaign tactics? Because if you look at this policy, at least, as, alone, I think the sense talking to MPs and aides is that they think it will play better with, I think, the base, but also the 2019 coalition. Whereas the MPs who are less happy today, when you speak to them, are those in those blue wall seats where they had the Lib Dems as the second largest party. And they are worried, not so much actually by the policy shift, but the idea that the way it's being written up and the perception, which people can debate, that the Tories are moving away from net zero. Now, Rishi Sunak keeps saying 2050 net zero is staying, but if it becomes, Tories scaling down commitments and you have other parties led to hoover up the votes, I think that could be a problem. I also think we're not actually really going to know on the polling where this is going for, at least a month. You might get some initial reaction. I mean, when it comes to the individual measures, the car delaying it to 2035, the polling's actually quite positive for the Tories on it, particularly with the voters they're going for. And therefore, I think in terms of Rishi Sunak's big picture, this is the beginning of him, having some dividing lines, but more what we're going to hear from him at conference with this idea that he wants to pitch himself as the leader who will tell the truth, who will not offer easy solutions and so forth. And I think this is probably the first policy announcement which is going to fit in with the narrative we're going to hear more from.
In the Today programme this morning, he was talking to Nick Robertson, which we can listen to a bit of now.
Where was this proposal for the government to put a tax on meat that you had to scrap with such a fanfare?
Yeah, there were a range of things that have been proposed by lots of different people.
Forcing people to have 7 bins, another proposal you said you've scrapped?
Yeah, so if you look in the Environment Act and the associated consultations that were in place around 2021 from memory, there's a very clear statement in there about moving to consistent collection for recycling.
Your former Environment Minister says you're pretending to halt frightening proposals that simply do not exist.
No, I reject that entirely.
It's all about politics. You're making a series of claims that aren't true.
No, this is absolutely about doing what I believe to be in the long-term interests of the country.
Nick Robertson was asking him about this 7 bins idea or the tax on meat, these policies that people didn't really associate with net zero anyway, but the government has this week said that they're like scrapping, which has led to a lot of ridicule. Do you think that kind of backlash has been justified?
Politicians always want to send up, sometimes imagined threats almost. So, Tony Blair was always great at doing this. Like, they want to do this, we want to do that, dividing lines, etc. And there's always a degree in which sort of you hype up a threat. That being said, you look at things like the Environment Act 2021, and there were policy suggestions that you could have 7 bins involved in that. You look at the Climate Change Committee and the way in which they've flirted with the idea of having increased taxes on things like meat. There is a basis in truth, although it's obviously not like the government wasn't going to introduce until yesterday meat taxes and now just scrap them. But that being said, you get down to a local level, but there are councils across England, for instance, where there's now debates about should meat be served at meals, etc., like that. So it's something that there's an element of that. But I agree. I think that big picture stuff, as Katy sort of alludes to, is that we're unlikely to see any sort of major shift in the polls as a result of this, because I just think that most people don't know, if you look at the polling, about net zero, and I'm not sure it's going to be really in itself enough to shift a vote, but I think it's kind of more about distinguishing and trying to make Rishi Sunak seem, although on the side of ordinary people, and try and cause a few headaches for Labour, who at the moment I think have really been trying to mimic the government on every time they've announced a cast or a change, etc., by going along with it. You saw this with HS2 this week.
I think you can also see how effectively these dividing lines in an election campaign, because Labour have confirmed that they would keep the car target 2030, so move it back from where the Tories are putting it. And therefore, what you keep hearing from Rishi Sunak already is, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. Is that the cost that Labour want to put on, households? So I think that it's going to be one of the things you keep hearing up in the build-up to an election. You also take the policy on small boats, the fact that Keir Starmer has now laid out what he wants to do, and the Tories plan to keep going on him for a returns agreement. So we are starting to see battle lines be drawn. It's just that these things don't happen overnight in terms of where you end up to. It's going to be a slow build, but I think it's beginning to be sketched out. So is it tricky for Labour? I think the Labour Party is quite divided on it. There are some who think that this is good for them in the sense, something I wrote about a while ago, they will be able to argue that the Tories are almost the extremists on net zero. Both parties trying to have that centre ground. You just need to debate what the centre ground is. And therefore this gives them fuel to the fire. They think it could misfire quite badly, particularly with some of the voter coalition. But others do worry it could become a cost of living issue. And what they don't want to do is have Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, because they are, punishing, voters when it comes to cost. And I think that's why there's a mixed picture, I would say, in terms of how good or bad. And I think it's telling that the main attack at the moment from Labour is effectively just saying, Liz Truss said this earlier this week in her speech on the economy. So, it's actually Liz Truss. They've done an inverse of the famous, pocket poster, which the Tories did, of Ed Miliband and Nicola Sturgeon. And they're saying, it's actually Liz Truss pulling the strings, which I think...
I love that.
Just as anyone who has to actually, cover these politics. I think I can see what they're doing in a way. I'm sure it's creating some amusement, but the idea of this number 10 pay much attention to what Liz Truss says, I think, is for the birds.
Well, actually, James, we can finish on Liz Truss because she, as Katy said, she did make that big speech early in the week. You are our resident Liz Truss expert, so tell us, you were there. What did she say?
Well, she was really reflective 1 year more on the mini budget, and I think it's quite interesting, some of the debate around today about Sunak's statement and the Climate Change Committee involved in that, and the analogy with the Office of Budget Responsibility, which obviously the Truss government said they weren't going to have the forecast for that mini budget. So I think it's interesting always looking at what Liz Truss did in government, and then Rishi Sunak's operation often seems to try and do the exact opposite of that in terms of making sure to kind of build a consensus, plan your battle, pick your battles, choose the right timing, etc. I think often take care around briefings, what you're actually going to do, and try and make everything you seem is really sensible at that. Whereas I think Liz Truss's operation, they were very much keen to emphasise how radical they were going to be and do things like the 45p tax cut. So it's interesting comparison.
Yeah, and the overwhelming message would seem to be, it wasn't me, Gov.
I think that, there was certainly a fair amount of recrimination going around, pointing fingers, and obviously of interest perhaps with the Bank of England and what the Bank of England got wrong ahead of today's inflation announcement. But there was certainly... I'm not sure how much notice will be taken in number 10 by what some of the former Prime Minister's comments were.
Yeah, still not much me and mea culpa.
Katy and James, thanks so much. In Australia, a referendum is set for the 14th of October to amend the country's constitution. If approved, the vote would establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, a legislative body just for Indigenous people. but it's a question that has torn the country apart. Helen Dale is a writer and lawyer from Australia. She's with me now. So Helen Dale, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, the concept of a referendum is quite traumatising, I think, for a lot of Brits now, but it seems like Australia is going through something quite similar. Can you tell us about this upcoming referendum called The Voice?
The referendum that we're about to have on the 14th of October in Australia is the first referendum the country has had since 1999. The previous referendum was on whether Australia would become a republic, and it failed in all states, so it really went down in a screaming heap. The referendum this time is to entrench a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. Now, I perhaps should explain exactly what the question is that will go to the Australian people. What you will see if you're Australian and you walk into the polling station and then into the polling booth on a piece of paper is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration?
Right, and it's been equated essentially as establishing a third chamber in the legislature for Aboriginal voices. But why is that needed? Are they not already voters in democracy? Why does there need to be some kind of ethnic or racial basis for that kind of representation?
What has happened, and it's perhaps best to draw an analogy with the Republic referendum in 1999. The most powerful argument against the no case, in other words, to the Republic, was if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is an Australian expression, because it's very true that Australia is a prosperous, orderly, well-governed country it's up there with Switzerland and Norway and ahead of the United States in terms of income per capita and purchasing power and wealth per capita. It's a very orderly, well-governed country. So one of the reasons the Republic referendum failed was that very basic fact. The difference with the voice argument is that since Federation in 1901, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy from governments of all stripes has been a failure. So the system is broken. So that is the most powerful argument for the yes case. The most powerful argument for the no case is the one that you pointed out, that it is indeed dividing people up and will allow a certain group of people to cast a ballot. And remember, voting is compulsory in Australia. So this is very important on the basis of their ethnic ancestry. You can't say race because the human species, there is only one race, the human race. But you can certainly divide people up by ancestry, as anyone who has ever taken a 23andMe test can testify. So the issue with the voice, and this is why it's so fraught and dividing and divisive, is both claims are true. The yes case claim is true. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy has been a terrible multi-generational failure in Australia, and the no case is true. This is indeed dividing up the Australian people on the basis of ethnic ancestry, which is not something that we have done for a very, very long time in this country.
Can you talk a little bit about that failure of policy towards the Aboriginal people? What do you mean by failure? And what have the policies been?
Oh, well, the policies have been very, very different over 100 years now since Federation. You can't really scoop up the pre-Federation period because Australia was a lot of separate colonies, each of them which were really, really quite different from each other. Australia is a more intensely federal polity than the United States. Okay, you can secede from the Australian Federation peacefully in a way that you can't from the United States Federation. They had a civil war over it. So the polity is quite different. But since 1901, what has happened is there were policies of assimilation to try to make Aborigines as similar to the various settlers from various mainly European countries, but later from Southeast Asia. There's a very, very significant Chinese population in Australia. First, that was one policy. It failed, it was an enormous mess. Then there were attempts to try to preserve the distinctive characteristics of Aboriginal civilization. This was a hunter-gatherer civilization, very, very unusually structured society. Most I'll give you one example. Most hunter-gatherer civilizations of which we are aware in the world are monogamous. A great chief will only have one wife. The Aborigines had a system of gerontocratic polygamy, which is extremely rare. It's a very, very unusual social system. And it seems to have been developed, and you can make all your Australian jokes now, because the environment in Australia is so dangerous. Older people, first men and then older women, need to teach younger people how to survive in it. It is so dangerous. And the best way I can get this across to you, and you can make another Aussie joke if you like, is the Indian cobra is the 15th most poisonous snake in the world. The other 14 are in Australia.
And that's why I'm never going to go to Australia, Helen. But actually, Helen, what does that actually mean for lives today for Aboriginal people? Because I think here in the UK, we have a very different race history. We also have our own problems with our own ethnic minorities in terms of how that history comes out in inequalities today. But for Australia, that does sound like a very different situation. So are we seeing basically in Australia where Aboriginals are relatively economically poorer, less educated, more prone to crime? What are the actual problems here that Aboriginals feel, or some Aboriginals, I should say, feel that they need a constitutional voice?
The biggest one is a difference in life expectancy. And the health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly Aborigines, it's less bad with Torres Strait Islanders because Torres Strait Islanders were a Melanesian, or are a Melanesian civilization, so they had already gone through the agricultural revolution. So their society is somewhat different, and they are also, ethnically constrained. They're in Far North Queensland and the islands of the Torres Strait, in between Far North Queensland and Papua New Guinea. So they're a bit different in this characteristic. But Aborigines, who are the majority, there are more Aborigines than there are Torres Strait Islanders, just as a matter of numbers. Catastrophically shorter life expectancy, serious problems amongst the youth in rural areas and remote areas with fetal alcohol syndrome, high crime rates, high unemployment, enormous sums of money shoveled in the direction of Aboriginal communities, none of which seem to do very much. And that is what is fed into this. And it's why initially, although the polls are cratering badly now and it looks like the Voice will fail, No will win like in the Republic, and it may win in every state. But initially there was 70% public support for a Voice, and this is going back maybe 6-12 months. And the reason for that is because of this huge policy failure over multiple generations. The expression that will be used in Australia is the phrase closing the gap. And when they talk about closing the gap between Aborigines and everybody else, and remember, 25% of the Australian people are born overseas. Australia is the most multicultural nation on earth, way ahead of the United States, way ahead of the United Kingdom. In terms of ethnic diversity, Australia is where it's at. So this huge gap, closing the gap in terms of health outcomes, in terms of employment outcomes, and in terms of incarceration rates, are the three big things that really, really stand out as the gap that people want to close on all sides of politics between everybody else and Aboriginal people in particular. The Torres Strait Islanders, as I was saying, occupy a sort of intermediate position, and they are culturally really quite different.
And of course, in a capitalist society, in a free democracy, inequality is okay. We take that so as to not live in total equality like communism or something like that. But Matthew Parris, our columnist, writes in this week's magazine that he thinks a lot of what's motivating both sides of the debate right now is the notion of white guilt, that actually the white majority in Australia has some kind of responsibility for the early years of taking over the land of the Aboriginals when they first arrived in Australia. Do you think that white guilt is playing into this debate?
It's certainly a large part of the yes case, and it is probably what is accounting for the decline in support for it. Initially, when it was first proposed, it was proposed by an Aboriginal fellow lawyer called Noel Pearson, who is widely respected in Australia as an extremely able intellect and legal practitioner, a really, really gifted guy. and he's admired across all sides of politics, Noel Pearson. So the support initially was, I suspect a lot of it was a we love Noel Pearson on all sides of politics because he's just really, really well regarded. But what has happened is you can't, it's very hard to control everybody if you're not a political party in promoting a particular argument in politics, and this is very much a political argument. And so what has happened is you finished up with attempts to play on people's guilt, the white people's guilt. And the thing is, it's not all white people. This is the difficulty when you've got a country that is so ethnically diverse. You've had reactions from members of Australia's ethnic minorities that are quite unpredictable and are probably not what the Yes case expected. Australia has large numbers of the Hakka minority, Malaysian Chinese, for example. And one of the reasons why we have so many Malaysian Chinese in Australia is because they object to the policies in their country of origin that favour Indigenous Malays over Chinese Malays, because Chinese Malays occupy a position in that society analogous to Jews in Eastern Europe and Central Europe before the Second World War. They are a market-dominant minority and very successful. So they don't like it. And so they've responded, a lot of them have with, oh, no, we saw this in Malaysia, you don't want it here. And I think the Yes case made the mistake of thinking everybody who's going to be arguing no is going to be a white person. But that's not been the case. The people who are arguing no, many of them are Aborigines, but they are from the remote communities. So they're from very, very sparsely populated areas of the country where some of the Aborigines, a significant number of them, still live quite close to a tribal lifestyle. And so the main leader of the no case is, and I can't actually say her full surname, Jacinta Najimpira. It's a long Aboriginal name and has she's a double barrel with Price, which is her husband's name, and she's from Central Australia, from the desert regions. She's been the main leader of the no case, and then the other no arguments that have tended to be made have often been of the type, well, no, we ran away from this in our country, and this is why we came to Australia. So when I say it's promoted division, it has promoted division, but it's allowed a lot of sort of guilty white people to find out what the rest of Australia is really like, because it's such a diverse country.
Yes, well, I guess the referendums really do show you something about a country, as we know here in the UK. Helen Dale, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, when Britain opened its doors to the Hong Kong Chinese following Beijing's clampdown in 2020, they came here in their hundreds of thousands. But why do we know so little about what is one of the biggest migrant groups to arrive in modern British history? For the magazine this week, I write that they will make as much of a mark on Britain as the Windrush generation did. Joining me now is Reverend Dave Ho Young, whose church is helping new arrivals in Leeds to settle in, and Simon Cheng, who was an activist in Hong Kong and granted asylum in the UK in 2020. He now runs the organisation Hong Kongers in Britain. Simon Cheng and Reverend Dave Ho Young, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Dave, I want to start with you because it's really through talking to you that I first got to cover this incredible story of Hong Kong migration to the UK. Can you tell us about the welcome sessions that your church has been putting on?
Yeah, so our church up in Leeds has been doing these welcome sessions for new arrivals from Hong Kong for probably around about 18 months now. And we have been working with a UK charity called Faith Action, who've put together some informal English classes. And we were asked to be one of the kind of churches in the Yorkshire region who would kind of roll out this course. So we've been doing that since April 2022, and I think we've probably had around about 200 or so people from Hong Kong coming through the course over those year and a half.
And for you, this is quite a personal calling too, isn't it? Because you're of mixed British and Chinese heritage yourself, but that it has been a complicated heritage in the past.
Yeah, so my dad came over from Hong Kong to the UK to study back in the 70s. He met my mum. They got married, had a family, and he lived here for a little while until I was about 10, and then my parents separated, and he went back to Hong Kong. And so I kind of was brought up without really that kind of Chinese or Hong Kong heritage. I come from a very kind of white area of the UK. I come from Shropshire, so not known for its diversity in that part of the world. So being Chinese and wasn't kind of a massive part of my story growing up. But in the last couple of years, it's something that I have been discovering more about, and something that I've been exploring kind of personally in terms of meeting family in Hong Kong. And then that has kind of dovetailed with the arrival of so many people from Hong Kong to the UK, and particularly to the parish that I work in, which has kind of been a major area that people from Hong Kong are wanting to move to if they come to Leeds.
What I found so lovely when I talked to you earlier in the year was how you were telling me about practicing English with the people who go to these welcome sessions, but they were teaching you Cantonese in return as well, which, you know, it really bringing that heritage back. Now, Simon, the reason we're talking about this is because in the last 2 years, through the British nationals overseas passport route, the British government has allowed over 100,000, the precise number is 125,000 Hong Kongers to move to the UK. Now, you yourself are one of those new arrivals, and you had to leave Hong Kong because of your political activism. Now, I know you've got an organisation here in the UK now where you're helping the new arrivals. So what can you tell us about the new Hong Kongers who are coming over? You know, where do they go? What sort of backgrounds do they have? What kind of work do they do? What kind of people are they?
Yes, thank you, Cindy, for having me. And we understand that, you know, this visa is quite comprehensive. That's open for almost all BNO visa holders that's coming to the UK. So it would be a bit different from the past. That's when people heard they immigrate into the UK. Either they could be more well educated, then they could be more well off, then they could come to the UK owning like the job visa or investor visa. But this time that is really open to the mass public. So it really comprehensive. But generally speaking, this bunch of people coming to the UK, they are more living in the environment of international city, more well educated, and of course that they would be familiar with the UK culture. So I think this batch of the immigration will be quite specific, that they share some historical linkage with the UK.
And your organisation has done a study with the University of Liverpool, I saw, where you found that 79% of the new arrivals are university educated. Many come with cash from selling their Hong Kong flats, because the average Hong Kong flat is £1.5 million. So they're not your usual political refugees. But Simon, do you think it's politics that's mainly driving them here?
I think so, because that's the people coming here for obvious reason. At least that is also the background of the visa policy. So I guess the people that come in here, they have more concerned about their own children's future. They want to live in a country with the academic freedoms. I think that is the most important thing. And this bunch of people, they also believe in their own life could be flourished, because they could also seek for freedom and democracy. And here, after a few years, we developed such a exiled community or new communities in here. And we think we're moving to a new phase that, you know, previously we think the migrants as a label, we need to be supported. But this time we think we could take leads for change. We could be engaging more within this UK society. So recently I've been funded by many governments, then also to launching different types of the programs to train some, we call it community leaders or community organisers from Hong Kong's to be in the UK, to learn more about what the UK culture will be.
That's brilliant. I mean, Dave, you've also had a similar experience to that, where one of the people who was attending your welcome session as a new arrival is now helping you run those welcome sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. We've kind of run two different sessions, two different programs. Sorry, and we're kind of just on to the third program now. And so actually, two of the people who did the first session are helping us to run the sessions now, and pretty much taking a lead in sort of hosting and planning each of our sessions.
And in general, what are the challenges do you see for the people that you come in contact with, Dave? The people that are coming to your church, we've outlined the ways in which they are much more, in many ways privileged than your usual new arrivals, but they still have challenges. Tell us about that.
I think I guess one of the main challenges is language. We're finding that most people from Hong Kong have a good level of English, but they just don't feel as confident as they would like to in terms of English. So that's one barrier. Another one is employment. So lots of people, particularly people who came in the first waves, were very successful in Hong Kong. They had very good jobs, whether in finance or in other areas. And what pretty much everybody has found coming to the UK is that they can't work at the same level that they did in Hong Kong. So they're having to take jobs perhaps in the same sector, but jobs that are perhaps a couple of grades down and certainly don't pay as much as they did in Hong Kong. And some people can't get into the sector that they worked in at all, so they're doing something completely different. But yeah, that step down, I think, is quite hard for a lot of people to kind of adjust to.
Yeah, I spoke to a couple of people at St Barnabas Church where, they might have done property management in Hong Kong and now they're working in a restaurant, or they might have done otherwise a white collar job and now they're having to think about retraining in beauty or going to a warehouse, something like that. I mean, Simon, presumably that's also quite representative of the Hong Kongers you come across. What do you think the government can do to make things easier?
Well, I think recently that the UK government launched different programs of funding for VCS organisation to provide support. And also the government prioritised employment support would be the top priority, because this bunch of the community usually have been banned from accessing public funds, except they have been in destitution. So that is also really important, and for giving them some confidence. Usually we are experiencing some culture shocks. Our academic and employment qualification experience need to refit into the UK market. And that is also important, that how can we start easier, because we have been lack of the credit history to start even the bank account. I think it would be quite useful to many ethnic minority groups or migrant groups, just like what we are now experiencing. But also something that might be a bit unique for us, that how the UK government could give us the assurance of our freedoms and safety even in the UK. We know that, the UK-China relations sometimes change from time to time, and how to make sure that the security of the guarantee of the security of our people living in here will be intact. We will not be harassed by any suspected informants or agents of the CCP regime, and that is also a really important topic for the UK government.
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. I mean, as we know, there is huge tension between the Hong Kong Chinese community here in the UK and the mainland Chinese community as well. Do you think that the authorities understand the nuances there, where a lot of Hong Kongers who have just come here often associate the mainlanders with the CCP kind of Beijing's control, and then vice versa, there's also a bit of resentment from the other direction. So do you think the British authorities understand that kind of complication?
I think there is still a learning curve for the UK government, the civil servants, to know the situations of the Hong Kong community. I think the also major part for us to address is about the mental trauma. We have a collective memory, what happens back in Hong Kong, that has really common to see the separation of the family, disagreements among different family members. They will feel lonely in here. They will feel upset that they are now living in freedom, but many of their fellow members and their people may be staying in the prison. They have a sense of guilty. How can we address this? And also, how can we restore trust amongst our community members, especially, as you mentioned, with the British Chinese community? It would be really important. I don't think that it's only about your own political opinion, but also under this situation, especially after the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, the threat is also really obvious and black and white on paper, on the legal document. So I think the people, they have a genuine concern for this. And that is also, the people have a concern if they'll be left behind when the UK government now try to engage back with China, and will the the promise to the freedom of Hong Kong and human rights issues about Hong Kong and other, ethnic minority in China would be brought back on the table. And that would be also important to see the attitude of the UK government.
And finally, Dave, we're in a moment in public discussions in this country where migration is a very sensitive topic. We've had, I would say, success stories like the Ukrainian refugees and the Hong Kong refugees coming over. But there is also a really live question at the moment over things like the Rwanda scheme, over things like migrants from other places, the small boats crisis. How do you see the fact that, there has been so little backlash or even discussion of the population of Eastbourne in terms of Hong Kongers coming over to the UK in the last 2 years? Is it because they're very good at integrating, and before your experience working on the ground, what do you put that down to?
Personally, I think it seems a bit of a hidden migration. I think people are kind of aware of what's been happening in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, and lots of people know that Hong Kongers are coming to the UK. But I think it is very much hidden. It's kind of spread all across the country. I think other groups of migrants, there's obviously the people crossing in boats gets all the headlines. People coming from Afghanistan from the evacuation a couple of years ago gets a lot of the headlines. Ukraine gets a lot of the headlines. But I think Hong Kong hasn't had the same exposure in the media that perhaps some of the other migrations have. So I think it is, in a sense, quite invisible, particularly to people who don't pay that much attention to maybe what's going on in Hong Kong.
Simon, does that wider rhetoric against new migrants in general, does that worry you and the Hong Kongers that you come across?
Yes, I don't think we should fall into the narrative that what is good migrant or bad migrant, because always that, like Hong Kongers coming here, we're always being framed as pretty much well-educated, well-off, etc. But actually, as an association, we receive quite many cases that actually they need to be supported. They might not be always being living in the stereotype of some kind of the people. And there has much more more vulnerable groups that their voices need to be amplified. And I think this rhetoric, the migrant group sometime, I think we need to empower, that is the same that, the migrants that we always see some kind of people, they need some support and help. And, it's really normal and usual. We try to bring it to the media and to other people to know, migrants also just the same as the local residents. And so they're going to be, and they are local residents now in the UK.
Simon Cheng and Reverend Dave Ho Young, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.